All right, Kim, thanks so much for that introduction. It's great to be with you again today, and great to be on the stage with Wade for another webinar here between Axiomatics and Radiant Logic. So as you said, Kim, we're going to talk about how the two technologies, federated identity and dynamic authorization, can be utilized to address some of the tougher access control issues that our customers are facing. And for those of you that are not familiar, just a little bit of high-level info about Axiomatics. So we focus on this topic of dynamic authorization so that we can secure the critical assets, the critical digital assets within your organization, and enable you to share them appropriately with the right audience at the right time and within the right context. And this can be protecting application portals. Very often these days, it's via API or microservice-driven applications, and then more and more as well, protecting data right at the database, being able to implement dynamic data filtering and dynamic data masking for relational databases, big data systems, data lakes, and so on. And then completing the life cycle here with the ability to report on the governance of access policies to this data so that you can certify and audit from a governance perspective and ensure that you've got proper coverage over your digital assets. So for my section here, before handing over to Wade, I'll talk a little bit about some of the legacy access control challenges that we see these days. Also, as a backdrop, discuss some of the current technology trends that are actually in some ways making it more difficult, and then look at the benefits of combining dynamic authorization with federated identity, and then Wade and I will talk a little bit as well about how we can bring these technologies together. So, and Wade, I think you're not on mute over there, so I'll just ask you to do that. And I'll remind you to unmute later as well. So part of the legacy challenge that we both see, I think both Radiant Logic and Axiomatics sees when we're talking to customers, are the different silos of information. And as raised as a farmer, it's tough for me to say get rid of silos, but in this case, we're talking about isolated islands or silos of information around identity, which Wade will touch on and focus on. But then there's these authorization silos, especially with legacy environments, you have a lot of hard-coded security logic within those apps, and that leads to challenges for access governance, for certification, and for trying to change those access rules within those applications as the business requirements or regulations change. And then on the data side, certainly historically with legacy apps, we had the notion of a databases assigned to a specific application, all hardwired together. And that's a huge trend that's changing as so many different organizations are building out data lakes or data warehouse environments, especially in the cloud, where they want to now bring together this data from many different sources and commingle it so that it can be utilized by machine learning, artificial intelligence, or other analytics tools. So how do we protect that data now that is losing those silo constraints and now commingling in these new cloud-based data systems? And then on the application itself, on that side, when we have so many microservice and API developed applications, can we try to address their authorization needs so they don't fall back on some of the legacy models that got us into trouble in the past? And when we talk about dynamic authorization, it's really a Venn or there's an intersection across some different domains here. Today we'll talk a lot about the identity domain and how we can bring together all of the different identity attributes or data, metadata together in an authorization context. But that's not the only perspective to look at. There's a lot of other context that gets combined with identity data, and that is the environmental variables, location, time of day, things like that, or the device type, or if it's a bring your own device scenario. So there's and there's also the context of the resource. Who owns the resource? What project or product line is it associated with? And that's coming from the data. So we can bring together this information with policies, and that's how we'll see that a dynamic authorization model really shines. And Wade, I know you'll cover this later in your section, but I think it gives an indication here of how data about identity information is spread in so many different environments. And that's only growing today as we get into more cloud-based applications and scenarios.
Definitely, Jerry, and my apologies for the mute button. I thought Jill had my back there. But this is an area where we'll touch on in more detail, because the challenges you just pointed out are all those sources of attribute information. And the more sources you can tap, the more you can bring that data together, the more you can leverage that data, the more powerful, the more secure, the more effective, the more you can align with your business requirements. But the nature of our environment was we didn't inherit a simple world where we can go to one place and get everything we need. There is no Walmart of identity information available in most organizations. So we'll talk about how you can address this and feed that information into Axiomatics and make this opportunity realizable.
Perfect. And as a bit more of a backdrop here, you mentioned business drivers here. And I wanted to touch on a few business trends that really are focusing our attention on those business outcomes that are really important. So it's not just about the technology as an enabler, but what are the business topics that we're addressing here? And here are just a few examples. As we see so many organizations go through a transformation to become more of a digital enterprise, we're talking about making the customer experience more enlightened, a richer experience, and providing that typically means providing them with more data or more modern services to access that data and visualize it. On the business analytics side, people want to have a better insight, be able to look at the data from their organizations and see what insights they can derive from that. Is there better ways to serve customers or partners in their ecosystem? And that relates to process automation and collaboration. Collaboration occurs across so many different kinds of communities, both internal to the organization with your supply chain partners and so on. And on the technology side, we have a lot of buzzwords that we talk about these days, but you'll see that come out in our conversation here as we go forward. It's all about API access to data, big data systems, bringing lots of information together for analysis and machine learning, developing applications in a microservice architecture, being able to containerize application systems. So these are all some of the trends that are a backdrop to how we develop software, because this is how our organizations, our customers want to deploy the identity and security infrastructure as well. So everything needs to be API driven, be broken down into microservices instead of big monolithic infrastructure services, be able to deploy in the cloud within a container, be able to protect resources within the cloud, or aggregate identity data from on-premise, from cloud systems, and from API-driven services. And of course, that means scaling to massive dimensions, whether it's number of users, number of applications, number of devices, amount of data, and so on. And then Wade, there's also this notion of zero trust. And I think for us at Axiomatics, we think more about precise access control or precise trust rather than zero, because zero to me implies zero access. So I think that's a trend or a buzzword that we're seeing thrown about these days. I think we have a different, more proactive view of that. And do you want to add any further comments about that?
Well, I agree. It's definitely a buzzword out there, and that is one of the traps with any buzzword. You try and take a real complex idea and a complex implementation and boil it down to two words. And the idea of zero, I think, is if you look at the underlying concepts, it's not assuming any access for people up front, but granting that access incrementally to people as they need it, and as you can verify and justify that they actually deserve that access. So you start out with a 0, just like in a relationship when you first meet somebody, but over time you gain more information, you gain more familiarity, you gain more data, you make more decisions, and you trust more, and you make more things available. The key here, though, is how do I make those decisions? How do I gain that information? How do I put that information into a process that I know has integrity? And this is where Axiomatics and Radiant Logic really can help you deliver on that buzzword of zero trust, moving the zero trust, nobody gets access to anything, to a very controlled, trusted, incremental process of expanding access at the appropriate times to the appropriate people based on good, solid information in real time. And that's where I think we can really make that happen.
Agreed, Wade. And in real time is exactly what I wanted to talk about next, is this runtime or real-time access control for different kinds of digital assets or resources, be that applications, whether it's a commercial application or a homegrown and home-developed application framework, or if you're just using REST and JSON APIs from Axiomatics. Of course, mentioned before, protecting through dynamic filtering and dynamic masking at the data level, whether that's a relational database or a big data system, through APIs, especially through the use or integration with an API gateway and SaaS apps as well. And when I talk about dynamic authorization, we often also will use the term attribute-based access control, or ABAC. So this is a runtime access model where we use attributes and policies that, they're the inputs to determining whether an access is permitted or denied. And the kinds of attributes that can be utilized here are vast. So it's not just who you are and, for example, what role you are assigned today, but what kind of device are you using? Is there a time of day constraint? Is there a limitation on where you can access this data from? As well as relational kind of parameters. How are you related to this data? Is it in the same department that you were assigned to? Or is this client record directly assigned to you? So these are the things that we can evaluate at runtime to respond with the proper access result. And from a high-level perspective, here's a diagram of the basic flow of an ABAC system. This is the Axiomatics Policy Server. So you have some user or system component trying to access some data within an application, in this case, viewing record 1, 2, 3. And within that flow, you have the enforcement point that takes that flow and constructs an authorization request, sends it to the backend Axiomatics engine, and this is where you've defined your policies and rules for access. They're loaded into memory, and then at the bottom, this is what Wade will focus his attention on, is we can also pull in different attributes that did not come with the original request. So maybe we need to look up Alice's role or her group membership. Maybe we need to look up where record 1, 2, 3 is assigned. So we can add that into the inputs and then come up with the result. In this case, permit that she can view this record, so the flow continues. So this is the basic workings of an ABAC or a dynamic authorization service. But I want to really focus on the secret sauce here, or the secret weapon, and that is the policies. Because as we'll see as we continue the conversation here, the access policies in a dynamic authorization system really are a direct mapping to the business requirements. We start out with simple natural language statements to derive what the access policies will look like in machine language. So this really makes the authorization model simpler, because we're not trying to translate it into an artificial construct. And we use all of these different attributes that are required for the different scenarios to grant or deny access. And we like to think that we can put the business users or the business owners more in control of the environment because they are controlling the assignment of this metadata. So you can have scenarios like the few here that I'll mention, where we literally start with just English language statements of what the requirements are. So doctors can view medical records of any patient in their department and update any patient record that is directly assigned to them. So there's nothing in here about the technical terms. This is a very plain statement for what a business requirement is. Or here's another one. Police officers can view any open case in their department and update any case that's directly assigned to them. Sounds a little bit similar to the first example. And this is often the case that we see the terminology is different. Where here we're talking about a case versus a patient record. But many times we see the scenarios are similar, but the exact terminology is different. And then finally, sales managers can view previous quarter results in their region once the results have been approved by the finance department. So how can we do this using attributes and policies? Well, hopefully you can see from my previous examples how attributes describe the user, resource, and this context very specifically. And then the policies provide the logic for determining the outcome, whether it's a permit or deny result. So the policies really are the bridge of this gap between the IT and the business, because this is always a challenge. We have these business rules that may come from the security department or a regulation for that particular kind of business, or just from the the nature of the business itself. How do we implement that within the IT environment in machine readable and enforceable language? So that's what we're talking about doing here. And I'm going to step through this medical example and to try to further visualize how this works. And we start by documenting the different scenarios, and we start to see where the attributes emerge from. So we document these English language statements, such as a member can view their own medical records, or they can view records of dependents. And the doctors, of course, have different kinds of requirements or constraints. In this case, they can view medical records of patients in their own department, or they can update records for patients that are directly assigned to them. And then you have other kinds of third parties, agents, in this case, insurance agents, or maybe administrative staff. But in this case, agents can view insurance claims in their own region. And if we start to break down these kinds of statements, what emerges is the metadata model. This starts to define or call out the different attributes that we use within the policies. And then you can also look at, well, where do these different attributes come from? So member, that would be a user role, and potential source for it would be the LDAP directory, and this is in the subject category. Then we see we have an action called view. Well, this is coming from the application. This is part of the message that's trapped by the enforcement point. And then the resource in this case, of course, are the medical records. Well, that's also within the application, and it's in the category of the resource. And what's interesting here is now we see there's a relationship parameter as well, because it's not just any record, but a member can view their own records. So then we need to know, well, who is the member, or what's their user ID or subject ID, and then we can compare that to the owner of the medical record. So again, this is where the policies come into play to be able to show these kinds of relationships and enforce the rules and policies accordingly. And I think we covered this in the previous flow, but what I wanted to call out here again is when we're looking to retrieve additional attributes, either about the user, in this case Alice, or about the record, well, this is where Radiant Logic really comes in to show the power of how all of this information can be consolidated, normalized, and aggregated, giving Axiomatics a single point of connection. And I think, Wade, we're going to come back to this topic as we move forward here, but we're talking about the runtime integration for Axiomatics is to have a single source for what is called the policy information point. And I think at this point, Wade, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk more about federated identity, and then we'll come back and talk about how that how that complements each other.
Excellent, Jerry. Thank you very much. And I should be showing my screen now. So let me go ahead and carry on with the conversation that you just started, because I think there's an excellent synergy here between Axiomatics and Radiant Logic, and you've done a really excellent job of explaining the front end process, the ability to use policies to make decisions about what access people have in the organization. And again, going back to the concept and the buzzwords that are out there now, continuous authorization, least privileges, zero trust, privilege access management, all these functions, everything is wrapped around the idea of, do I know who you are? And once I know who you are, what do I give you access to? And unfortunately, in the IT industry, a lot of our systems are very static. We assign something, and that sort of is the way it is going forward until someone intervenes. But in the business world, and the way we interact with other people and the way we interact with the applications that we use every day, it's a much more dynamic model. It's a much more fluid scenario where in one moment I may need certain access to certain things to do a certain job. That's not the only job I do that day. That's not the only interaction I'm going to have with an endpoint. So in another moment, as a doctor moving from one patient's room to another, or from one floor to another, or from a surgery ward to a recovery room, his role in the organization, his interactions change. In the same moment, his authorizations need to be able to dynamically adjust to his requirements so that his efforts are free-flowing, so he feels a frictionless environment. And this is really where the power of Axiomatics and Radiant Logic together have a real strong impact on delivering that concept here. So the idea of attribute-based access control, or dynamic authorization, of being able to marry that moment of authorizing a user to access a certain resource with the proper information to make that valued decision. Because in the end, we want people to get access to everything they need in the moment they need it, but at the same time, we're charged with making sure that bad actors and outside forces don't gain access to information they should not have. Now, you can lock the whole world down and give no one access to anything and be completely safe, but then you can't conduct business. And business will almost always err on the side of, hey, get work done, deal with security later until there's an issue. It's kind of the horse in the barn door consideration. But here you have a model where you can actually now implement a dynamic active system that will allow you to implement security in the moment in a way that has the minimum impact to the end user, and properly configured, properly managed, is virtually invisible. They get what they need when they need it. They have the ability to do their job. And bad actors and bad operators don't, because they don't have the same profile, the same information, the same attributes, the same data being used to evaluate their policy, so they're blocked right at each step in the process. And it's not, again, the department store model where once I'm in the front door, I can go everywhere and do everything. It's very much the New York Diamond District jewelry store model where I go in the front door and I'm immediately inside a cage that doesn't allow me access into the jewelry store until I provide additional information and validate my need to move into the jewelry store itself. And then I'm not going to see the big flawless diamonds until I've even validated myself further. So this model has to be replicatable within the business environment, and I think we do an excellent job of that with combination of Axiomatics and Radiant Logic. And I'll talk right now a little bit more about where Radiant feeds all that information you need to make those granular decisions. So one of the quotes from the NIST team, the NIST team is the federal government's team that is focused on building and implementing and promoting standards within security and access control, because their model is around securing some of the most valuable information in the country, but also propagating those best practices and learned experiences out into the business world so that people can benefit from all the work that's been done already. And their quote there at the very beginning, attribute-based access control is the latest development in the evolution of access control models going back over 40 years. And that's a recent quote from just a couple of years ago. So you can see that this is technology that is coming of age now and is basically at the right time, at the right place for meeting the level of requirements we have. Because in the past, a lot of organizations, and not to their fault, just the way the world worked and what they had to work with, operated in a much more role-based, macro-level access control. And that allowed a tremendous amount of variation or slip room inside that model, where a bad actor with just a little bit of edge in his access could do more than he should have been able to do if you had a more granular model in place. And this is what we're delivering. So key to this is that complete profile of the user, is the ability to make those decisions because I know everything I need to know about that user. I have enough granularity. If all I know is that you're a vice president and you're in sales, that may not be enough information to evaluate all the places in the organization that you want to go and be able to give you the proper access. But if I know that you're the vice president, you're in sales, you're located in New York, you're in charge of high-value customers, you've been with the company for over 20 years, and you have security clearances at the highest level, now with that information I can make much more granular decisions about what you get access to. Maybe you can now edit the pricing schedules, where before just being a vice president of sales was not enough. But also I may need to know, well, yes, you are that person, but where are you coming from? Are you coming in from the corporate headquarters, or are you coming in from a hotel in Beijing because you're on a trip to China to build more business, but we don't necessarily want you accessing corporate sensitive information in that particular environment. So I have to know even more than just what's in the system. I got to pull all that together. And as Jerry mentioned earlier, I've got to do this in real time. I have to do this in a way that does not hinder or hamper my executives, my salespeople, my researchers, my developers, my staff, my manufacturing people, everybody in the organization, and especially my customers. If I'm starting to talk about adding this kind of granular experience to my customer authorization, I don't want them to sit and wait while the wheel spins on their browser or on their phone for a decision to be made as to whether they can go forward or not. It has to be in near real time. And it has to be in near real time in two modes. One, for the user experience, but at the same time, things change. I move from sales to marketing. I leave the organization. I gain more security clearance, or I have an event that causes my profile to change. That has to be reflected as close to real time as possible in those decisions, because those decisions are based on that information. If the information is stale, then I'm not making a value decision. I'm letting something happen that shouldn't happen. And that's counter to the whole concept we have here. So complete, real time. But the challenge there is all this information is scattered, as Jerry pointed out in the previous slide, and we'll see. So I've got to pull that data together. But it's not, again, like we have all the information in one format, in one structure, in one schema, all in the same language, all in the same place. There's a lot of effort and work necessary and capabilities necessary to pull that data together and do things like normalizing that information. But it is the most secure form of authorization available, and this is what's becoming more and more critical. Organizations are realizing, just like they realized as they move to a digital customer experience, it's a competitive landscape out there. There's exposure from a security context, if you do not have good controls in place, and people are being held accountable. So from the top down, the pressure is coming saying we need to be able to deliver as secure and functional and business-related environment as my competitor is, because if I don't, either I'm going to lose business, or if there's a breach, if there's an issue, if there's a compromise, I could lose my job, or someone higher in the organization, or value to the company can be lost. So these things have to be in place. You have to leverage this information. But as you saw earlier in this slide, the nature of the world we're asked to implement this in wasn't built for this kind of model. Unfortunately, everything evolved over the past 30 or 40 years from the time we left the mainframes and started to go out into a distributed model, where applications sort of thought of themselves as islands. They had little silos of information. They operated onto themselves, and they were fine and happy. But as we started to get more connectivities, we started to share more information. We started to realize we had to build bridges and connections and scripts and move information around the environment and translate it and transform it. And in this simple diagram, you've got 4 or 5 applications on the inside and the outside and a couple of sources, and you can see how complex it gets. Imagine in an organization where I have 1,000 databases, I have 8,000 applications, I have multiple AD domains, I have a cloud infrastructure, and I have an on-premise infrastructure, I have an international footprint. How fast and how crazy and how complex does this information set become? And how do I manage that? How do I handle that information? And this is where Radiant Logic comes into play. We can help you with that. We can take that burden off of your shoulders and deliver you what attribute-based access control and dynamic authorization needs, which is the same thing every application and every front-end provisioning, self-service password management, single sign-on or authorization and auditing compliance platform, any of those applications that deal with identity data, they all at the end of the day want to go to one place to get all the information they need in exactly the format they want it, in real time, to make the decisions they need to make, to give the access they need to grant, to be able to deliver the reports, to be able to catch the segregation of duties violation. They want that information as simple as possible, as fast as possible. And the finer grain that information is, the finer grain those authorizations can be. And this is what ABAC gives you, along with a highly flexible model. If you look at the example Jerry gave you about building authorization for a doctor in a sentence, you have the ability to describe access control in the way you describe a business process. You can talk to a business line manager about, hey, describe to me how nurses gain access to patient records. Oh, well, if a nurse is in this department and the patient is being assigned to this department and they're on the same floor and it's during her shift, then she can access his records. But when she goes off shift, she can no longer access her records. That description can be written into a policy, and you can almost read it left to right and see that. But all those commas in that sentence are preceded by a piece of information, an attribute that has to be evaluated. It has to be pulled into the system. Is she on her shift or is she off shift? That information has to be available and has to be evaluated in order to make that decision. And this is where ABAC and dynamic authorization comes into play. It can actually look at all those individual pieces of information and make a decision and say yes or no. And then as the information shifts, as the request shifts, reevaluate, make another decision, say yes or no, and do this dynamically as the person moves through their day. But you need to have all those attributes. You need to have a powerful policy engine that can author those sentences. You can describe them in a way that works, and then be able to evaluate those in real time and make those authorization decisions. And behind all that, you need to have a central attribute server. I've seen so many diagrams over the past 5 or 6 years where authorization models are displayed, and there's all the mapping of how the single sign-on solutions or the access management layer transfers information back and forth, and tokens float around and things get built. But in the bottom right-hand corner is always this one little box that's sort of the identity server. and then magically everything already exists in that little box, and you don't have to think about that when you're designing all the rest of this architecture or this workflow, because you just assume that all the data is sitting right there and available to you. But as you saw earlier in that Star Wars diagram, that's not an assumption you can make unless you've implemented Radiant Logic. But the platforms all assume that's the way the world works. So you need to build that evolutionary model. You need to move to a model where you have that central store of identity information available in the exact context, structure, schema, protocol, format that the application needs and can make informed decisions about. Now, the challenge here, though, is how am I going to manage these attributes centrally with very large volumes of data? So you need to have the ability to store this information after you've done the correlation, after you've mapped the identity information together, after you've built this global profile. You need to be able to pull all this data together and then materialize it so it's available at the speed of a directory. It can't be available at the speed of a database doing joins in real time. As you remember from the healthcare.gov rollout of 10 years ago, the delays in getting answers to whether I got a discount on my insurance were amazing because the system was trying to calculate complex relationships and authorizations in the background in real time. That doesn't function in a business model. So you have to pull that information together and have something like Radiant Logic that can scale to large volumes of data, millions of records. And then you have to source all that identity and those attributes and the context of that information. You have to understand how that information relates and provide that to the policy decision point. That's the piece of the Axiomatics solution that says, okay, I have a user making this request. To grant this request, what are the policies in place that say yes or no? Run the filters, find the information, evaluate that policy, come back with an answer, and make a decision on whether or not that user gets to go forward or not. So this has to be sourced there. And then you have to enhance and simplify the definition of fine-grained authorization policies. And this is critical because when you're authoring a policy, you don't want to say, if someone is in New York, and then describe that as capital N, capital Y, little n, little y, spelled out New York, misspelled New York, all the variations of the way you know the data has been input into your system, or ways you may not even know. If you have to write out all those variations in the policy for every attribute because the backends are such a mess, or it was spelled out in one platform for a particular reason, it was abbreviated in another, and when you pull that information together, you don't know what you're going to get. That's going to make policy evaluation much more cumbersome, much more difficult to author, much more difficult to audit. So normalize that information. Supply that data from Radiant Logic as a single value with a single format, regardless of how it was sourced. And then you can actually evaluate that policy much more quickly, author that policy much more quickly. So when you're looking at an ABAC model without a centralized attribute server, then your policy information point is something you have to build yourself. And the scope and the challenge of building that is just beyond most organizations, because if it was easy, everyone would do it, and they would have done it a long time ago. So you need a product like Radiant Logic that has been built over the past 18 years and optimized by using it in conjunction with some of the largest customers with some of the most complex environments in the world to build an optimized platform that delivers all that information to the policy information point in a normalized, clean, pristine, and performant model that can be then leveraged and used by the policy decision point to allow the user access to those applications. You have to have these two pieces working together. Radiant Logic is not going to author policies. It's not going to do the policy enforcement piece on the application level on an ABAC model. But in combination with Axiomatics, you can leverage the investment you've made in building those global profiles to add this layer of granular security to your model. So it's really a hand-in-glove marriage here, where the complementary nature of both solutions is so large that you end up with a multiplying effect, a force multiplier, where the investment in both is exceeded by the performance of the team. Now, One of the capabilities within RadiantLogic for providing identity information and context is modeling existing objects, attributes, and relationships. As you looked before at the information that Jerry put out in terms of the way a doctor gets access to patient records in a particular scenario, there is a relationship there. The doctor has a relationship to his department. He has a relationship to the organization. He has a relationship to the hospital. He has a relationship to his team. So those relationships need to be maintained. You need to have a platform that's not just a simple flat list of attributes, but you need to be able to understand how that information relates to it, because there's contextual nature. If in this situation, along with that information, I can make this decision type of models that you want to be able to build, and Radiant gives you that capability much more powerfully, much more effectively than any other platform I've seen, because the ability to maintain that existing relationship as it exists on the back end natively, but also to build relationships and build hierarchies within the data that can be leveraged by a tool like Axiomatics. And that unique global profile becomes critical, but that's a challenge that is very difficult to do manually. You cannot build a union across multiple backends with different identifiers and key field linking without a really strong logic engine like RadiantLogic to pull that all together. And then on top of that, things change. They change every day. People move, people leave, people join, people's profiles are modified. The place they are in the building changes. That information has to be recalculated and represented in a very dynamic model. So there's the power of Axiomatics to make a dynamic evaluation of the data, and RadiantLogic to deliver that information regardless of the churn that's going on in the back end, so you're always making decisions on accurate information. And then the contextual values, again, those bringing that out of those silos. If I have information in my back end systems, I can pull that together and be able to deliver that full breadth of knowledge to the policy engine to make even richer decisions. And as Jerry mentioned, this is stuff flow. Here you have from RadiantLogic to the information point, to the decision point, out to the application. This is a critical model here. And this illustrates a little bit more about what it looks like in the real world model. I'm pulling together data from multiple different directory formats and schemas, database backends. RadiantLogic can normalize that data now so that I have a consistent set of attributes. And even though the attributes vary on the back ends, I can normalize that. I may have a department ID of sales 234, but in my normalized data set, I'm going to call it sales. And I'm going to give it an end department designation as a label, because I have full control over this data here. And the reason I do that is because when I bring Axiomatics Policy Authoring point in, I have a business line manager saying, okay, let me see, doctors who are in, let me look at all the different departments. Oh, oncology, pick that one, can access, and you're moving through a normalized set of information. So the variables they have to deal with, the options they have to look at are much narrower and much more in line with what they're expecting. And then RadiantLogic builds that profile for the user with the same data set, with the same normalized data. So when I look at an individual user, the attributes that I built the policy on align with the attributes in the user profile. So when the decision point says, hey, for Andrew Fuller, is his department sales? Yes. Is his title VP sales? Yes. Even though in the back-end system it might have been a vice president sales in one particular platform, I've normalized this data. I made it available to the authoring point and the decision point. I have consistency. Things evaluate very quickly and very powerfully. And again, you can build this from attributes from multiple different sources, regardless of schema, regardless of structure. We can mix everyone together. It's like cats and dogs living together. It's like the United Nations. It doesn't matter what language you speak or what sub-language you speak or what culture you have or how you dress or how you prefer to drink your tea. All that can be incorporated and included to build that rich experience that you need to make that kind of granular decisions in the system. And handling things like overlapping identities from multiple platforms and being able to handle different identifiers and recognize users that are the same person in different systems or the same identifier that's not the same person. There's a lot of work being done in the background here. to produce this aggregation of attributes into a global profile that can be then evaluated and read and used to enforce that granular access control with Axiomatics. So there's multiple layers here for solving the authorization challenge. We're talking about attribute-based authorization here as being the most modern, the front of the curve, but also very tested, very solid, very mature solutions, because Axiomatics and Radiant Logic have been at this for a long time, and we know how to deliver this solution. But not every application has necessarily evolved yet to a point where it can understand or interact on that granularity with attributes. So you have group-based access still in a lot of LDAP applications. A lot of systems look to a group to make a decision. You're thinking, well, yeah, this all sounds wonderful, but I've got these big macro groups, and that's the way we do things, and so I guess I don't get to play. Well, that's actually not the case, because with Radiant Logic and Axiomatics, we have the potential here for melding together those two models, for taking legacy systems and leveraging groups, but driving those groups from a policy driven out of the definitions created inside Axiomatics. And the way that's possible is that Radiant Logic can actually create dynamic groups based on attribute values, based on the information inside a policy that applies to a particular set of users. I can populate that group with everyone who meets that filter. And I can do that dynamically, but then I can turn that into a static group, store that locally so it's available at the speed of a directory, and an application that only reads static groups will see the members of that group or the member of attribute for each group of that member's profile, even though I'm generating that information based on a series of attributes, based on a filter derived from a policy inside Axiomatics. So Jerry, you want to talk a little bit about how that kind of blending now gives you ability to sort of do the future today with what people already have in place?
Sure thing, Wade. And I think the way you've described this to me is it's an on-ramp for some of these legacy applications, or a way to modernize them without making changes to those legacy apps, because that's often a challenge when organizations want to externalize the access control within a legacy system. It might be something that's homegrown and been running for a long time within the organization, or it might be a commercial application, and they're limited in that they only use LDAP protocol. I say only, I mean it's a very powerful system, but there's no way, really no cost-effective way to go back and change those applications to do something different. So what we're talking about here, as you just described, Wade, is to use the power of Radiant Logic to build those dynamic groups. But how are those groups defined? Well, we define ABAC policies within the Axiomatics system, and from there, we're able to generate those LDAP filters that then in Radiant Logic populate those group lists that you just described, Wade. So this gives us a way to extend the scope of governance over these applications, because otherwise, how do you determine who has access to what? We need to, unwind all those different group lists and figure out who is in them, where we can really streamline that governance process and give these applications a bit of ABAC medicine, if you will, without a huge impact to them, without really almost no impact to those applications. Does that sound right to you, Wade?
Oh, it definitely does, and I think this is also an excellent model for really getting the granular control that you'd love to have from an attribute-based access control system and dynamic authorization to a model that is really, in most situations, very macro-based. Groups are very large and sort of narrow, not narrowly defined in the access they give, because it's difficult to manage statically a lot of groups. Unfortunately, most organizations have had, over time, as many groups grow up in their environment as they have users. We talk to companies with 10,000 users, they have 10,000 groups. We talk to companies with 100,000 users, oddly, they have 120,000 groups. It seems to be almost a one-to-one, but they can't manage and control those groups very effectively because they were created by people who are no longer there, or they're created for purposes that are not understood, or they're not clearly aligned with the policy. With this model, not only am I automatically generating those groups, but I'm automatically decommissioning those groups when the policy is altered. I'm making it a much more granular model, and I'm increasing security now because my access control can be audited back to a set of business policies, as opposed to just the fact that I'll release the capability of creating groups to anybody in the super user model in a particular department. So there's a lot of benefits that flow out of this to really starting to tackle that elephant in the room of I've got as many groups as people and I have no idea what they're used for and I don't even know if I can get rid of them. And when I go through my attestation and auditing every year, I just say yes to everything because who knows? Now we can change that conversation too, and that's really a powerful shift. So the last piece I want to touch on here is the concept of conceptual views, and I'm going to go through this a little bit more quickly because we want to get a couple of questions in before the top of the hour. But the idea of context goes back to, again, that sentence formation and the policy authoring point that Jerry illustrated. I need to be able to understand the relationship between objects, users, systems, patients, applications, and as relationships are built not just on the attribute values, but how those objects relate to each other. And this is one of the powers of Radiant Logic, to define that kind of hierarchy, that kind of structure, that kind of ability to model your data. So even though it may come from multiple sources, each with its own structure and its own format, I can bring those different objects together, and using the attributes that link them together and the relationships, I can build a hierarchical model here that relates that information together. So I have Nancy, who owns the Great Outdoors account, that purchased Order 21 that contained a Conestoga backpack. That flow of data now can be a template for your policy where Nancy has access to all customers that she owns, and she can see all orders those customers placed if they were placed through Nancy, and she can see inventory for any of the information that was purchased by her customers that's shipping. So to do that, you have to have that relationship. And in the back-end systems, you look at a cloud application, a couple of databases, a directory. Those don't play well together. They don't even speak the same language. So being able to put them together is one step. Being able to put them together and maintain relationship is a really powerful model. So now I start to actually add data modeling and structure to my data, and I start to leverage that in a way that my policy authoring point can see those relationships, can understand that model, and can then leverage that data to make even more effective authorizations. You don't want to authorize something to someone that will never come into play because that back-end relationship isn't there. That's a waste of effort and a waste of overhead. But you do want to author policies that become as closely aligned to the business relationship, the business structure as possible, because we're trying to take IT, which is a very much a square corner model, and put it into a round corner world. And this is where the combination of Axiomatics and Radiant Logic lets you remodel and remold your information that way. Now, this is a diagram here of our federated identity service. That's the core function that I've been talking about today, the capability of Radiant Logic to do all the connections and connectivity and modeling here. We have a couple of additional products. Our ICS solution allows you to move data around the organization while you're modeling it, transforming it, correlating it, bringing it all together. And our Cloud Federation service lets you step out and provide that information in a SAML WS-Fed OpenID Connect model for SaaS applications, for hosted apps that are off-premise, where you may not have that same control you have in an ABAC model. So it's a really complete set of solutions here. And just to summarize the synergies of Axiomatics and Radiant Logic, again, we're going to reduce development and maintenance costs on applications. This is key. Getting applications out the door faster and making them less expensive to manage, secure, and update and monitor is key to the success of any organization, any business. But all that's driving this on the back end, that the brakes on this car are the security concerns. I have to make sure it's secure. I can't just throw applications out, let anybody have access, and just cross my fingers that everyone's nice. That's not the real world, so you have to build in security. And you've got to bring it to the speed of time to market. So these applications have to be integratable and deployable and manageable, and also adapt to change at the speed at which markets have changed. If you looked at the transformation from customers to a digital environment in the last 5 years, it's been a phenomenal shift. Our move to the cloud has been a phenomenal shift. So we're now dealing with timeframes that are much more condensed. And everything is evolving. Your business is evolving, big data is coming along, the cloud, devices are affecting what you're doing, so all that has to be flexible and powerful. And that's the great thing about a policy engine with Axiomatics is, hey, if I have a new scenario, I can create a new policy. All I have to do is bring the objects and the attributes together, and I can generate the information I need to secure that whole new world that no one imagined 6 months ago. And doing that through compliance and regulations, enabling business opportunities to be more quickly brought to market, and then future-proofing your infrastructure. Nothing is more scary than making a large investment in an IT infrastructure, dropping it into place, doing all the integration work, getting it humming, and then finding out that everyone made a left turn and you're stuck on the rails you can't get off of. You need to be able to adapt to a whole new market model, and you're stuck in this now legacy situation. The flexibility and capabilities of Radiant Logic that we've been delivering for the past 18 years, the advanced capabilities within Axiomatics to model and deliver policy enforcement in almost any circumstances, future-proofs you for whatever's coming down the line, and be able to give you that granularity and delivery that you're looking for. So what I'd like to do now is we're at the top of the hour, but we do have a number of questions, and I did want to get to some of those. So let me do that real quickly for everyone that can hang on. If you ask the question and we don't answer it now, then we are going to address these through email directly and make sure that everyone gets their answers back. But Jerry, let me throw a couple of questions up here. Can either product use Azure Active Directory as an authentication repository? And from Axiomatics standpoint, I'll say that yes. Radiant Logic looks at sources of identity information, whether they're just attributes or they're authentication platforms that can do credential checking. We look at those in an agnostic way. We will, anything we can connect to, anything we can talk to over an API, a standard protocol, we can use that information and make that information available. And Azure Active Directory is another platform that we have integration to. So we can not only bring information and attributes down from Azure to be used in your policies if you're setting them up there. We can also use credentials up there as the authentication check at the front door. But the key here is not just authenticating a user with a credential, but then authorizing the access he has in a very granular way as you move forward. And that's a way where, again, with Radiant and Axiomatics, you can pull those Azure attributes in together with other information, expose it to the policy authoring point, and use that data as part of your granular access control. Jerry, do you have any comments around the Azure environment? Because that's definitely a big player in the space these days.
Yeah, agreed. Agree with what you said so far, Wade. And also we can run our systems there in the Azure environment as well. So that's the only thing I'll add to what you said.
Excellent. So next question here, and this is getting a little bit more into the techie side of it, but what's the practical limit to the number of repositories queried for attribute data? Tens, hundreds, thousands, for example. If we have 500 applications all with their own attribute repositories, would these solutions be able to pull all this data in? We have a number of scenarios in the Radiant side, and I'll start with the foundation, and then I'll get to Jerry's discussion of the policy side. But in terms of pulling information together from multiple backends, It depends on how you're handling that data. If we're making queries to the back end, we have quite a bit of scope and a number of sources of information that we can handle. And in one large customer implementation, we were pulling data from 2,400 stores across the country, and we built a roll-up architecture that allowed us to sort of do a bridgehead model to bring that data up, because part of the constraint is actually around the operating system and how many concurrent connections can be maintained. But we have ways of pulling all that information, that data together. The key here is that you have the capability within Radiant Logic of storing that data in our HDAP store, our highly available, highly scalable big data repository, so that you're not making a real-time query to 1,000 backends. You can imagine how long that would take to make a decision. But you're listening on those backends so you can detect a change and apply that to the stored copy of the data. So the data is accurate, sourced from multiple backends, but then available in one place. So when Axiomatics goes to get the data, it has one place to go, one place to bring it in. We want to look, though, at connectivity, too, because one of the challenges, and we'll be very upfront about this, a lot of applications that were written a long time ago black box their identity stores. There is no API, there is no connectivity to that data information. So when you're looking at applications and you're looking at evolving your infrastructure and you're looking at data stored inside an application, you need to be cognizant of how that data is accessible. Can it be dumped out in a file? Great. Can it be accessed through an API? Wonderful. Is it accessible through a database table? Even better. If it's absolutely locked down tight, then you have to look and see how else we can leverage that data. Jerry, from your perspective, in terms of the scope of attributes, what do you normally see in a policy authoring or policy enforcement place in terms of scale?
Well, there's different dimensions of scale. When you think about the number of attributes that could be utilized in within a set of policies that are dealing with a different application, it's typically in the number of dozens, although there are certain cases where there could be hundreds of attributes involved in a policy definition and in a set of policies and rules within a tree structure. So that's one dimension, and there's no practical limit. It's really about how you break down the management of the environment. Typically, once you get past a threshold, you're not consolidating hundreds or thousands of applications within a single view. You typically break that up and distribute or delegate the policy authoring to the more individual teams, whether that's an application group or a line of business or some other natural boundary within your organization. And then the runtime policy engine itself can be scaled up to handle large capacity because you can have multiple domains of the policy engines also aligned with your business application owners or geographic boundaries, or however it's most appropriate to fit in with your operational preferences. And then, of course, with Radiant Logic aggregating the backend data, that really simplifies the architecture because they can be co-located for the most efficient performance at runtime as well.
Excellent. And I'll make one more comment too, as it sort of came to me as you were speaking, that from an architectural standpoint, if you think about those endpoint applications were probably provisioned or users are created on those systems, there's a lot of information potentially inside those applications that's replicated data from other platforms or from other sources of truth. If you're in a certain department and that department's represented in that application, if you've got 100 applications, you're probably in the same department in every application. So you don't necessarily need to source every attribute. You're looking for the unique data in that system or the systems that are the sources of truth. That starts to narrow the scope of how much data you have to consume in order to make an authorization decision and the variations in that. So there's a lot of ways to sort of tune the system, I think, and you can definitely address that. We are at 10 minutes after the hour. I'm looking at some excellent questions here, and literally I could go another hour with you, Jerry, and continue this conversation. But what I'm going to do, though, in the essence of time and audience participation, is go ahead and wrap this up and thank everyone for your attendance today. We will answer all these questions offline. We'll send out a copy of the slides and a recording of today's webinar to everyone that registered. And Jerry, I want to extend my thanks to you and Axiomatics for your partnership, your years of working diligently with Radiant Logic, and looking forward to continuing that going forward.
Thank you as well, Wade. It's always a pleasure, and thanks everyone for attending. We'll talk to you all soon.